Hello YouTube. Sorry for the delay between the last installment and this installment. Been extremely busy with, life in general, but it's now Thanksgiving break and I have some time to devote to putting up this installment. I hope to get bag C done as well. The kit is already built and I've run it a few times. I've got the pictures all taken of the build. I just need to finish putting the presentation together. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks I will have bag C completed as well. But this is bag B, so let's get on with it. So bag B starts off with step 17, and that's where putting together the front uprights. So the bag comes with dog bones, outdrives, the hop-up aluminum rear uprights, and a whole bunch of snazzy blue aluminum ball connectors. I also have swapped out the standard metal shielded ball bearings that come with the R kit, and I've replaced them with rubber shielded ball bearings. So as in the last video, I am going to be using Team Associated green slime in this part of the build as well. So the part number is ASC 1105 if you want to get yourself some of this. So I put a tiny little dab on my fingertip, and then I drop in the rubber O-ring. Now the rubber O-rings that come with the kit are red. I find them to be too hard. I don't care for the red. I think they also harden up over time. So I replaced the kit supplied red rubber O-rings with these Team Durango 4x2mm S40 grade silicone O-rings instead. So the S40 is an indicator of the squishiness of the silicone used to build this. Also, the color differentiation. Different brands use different colors to differentiate between the different grades of silicone for the squishiness. So as of the recording of this video, Team Durango is no longer in business. Boo. But I put the part number down anyways in case you could still find some of these, but they don't have to be the Team Durango ones. You could use the red kit ones, or you can find any old 4x2mm S40 if you want to match what I'm using. At any rate, I coat the rubber silicone O-ring with the green slime and then put it down into the outdrive. And then you can use the dog bone. I use the Tamiya tool to push the O-ring down into the bottom of the outdrive like so. And that allows you now to build up your front uprights. So we've got the uprights removed from their sprues. We've got the ball connector screwed into the upright, and then we've got the outdrive with its rubber shielded bearing pushed through so that you have two built front uprights. So then we move on to step 18. Now, the step 18 here is the standard ground clearance instructions. So the manual tells you to go to page 19 to build the high ground clearance version, which is what we want for a rally car. So this is what those instructions look like. Essentially, we just invert the uprights. That changes the ground clearance. So when we're building the front, the crown spacer will be on top and the trapezoidal spacer will be below. That'll be the front. And in the rear, as you can see, we go from this version to flip it upside down. We use this version, which as you can see from the picture, the etching on the upright will be facing out towards the back of the vehicle. So this is the rear of the vehicle. So when we put together our front upright for high ground clearance version, we put on our little crown spacer on the top of the upright. We drop the arm down on top, and then this is the underside. Then we put the trapezoidal shape here. So back it up again. As you can see, we'll go upright, crown spacer, slides through the pillow ball, and then screws down through with a little spacer. This will be on the top. On the bottom, what we have is the upright goes through the pillow ball, trapezoidal shaped spacer with a screw on the bottom. So we have the crown spacer, flip it upside down. We now have the pillow ball the upright going through the pillow ball. This is the underside. we put the trapezoidal spacer in, screw it down, and then flip it over. We put the plastic spacer in and the other screw down in on the top. And we have a built upright. So that's what that looks like. And then of course do it on the other side. So step 19 are the rear uprights. So again, we need to refer back to page 19, but we'll be using the aluminum upgrade uprights, and of course rubber shielded bearings, and the Team Durango purple O-rings. So again, page 19. For reference, we want to invert so that we have the etching facing to the back, and the hubs are a little bit lower than what they would be in standard. So this is what that will look like here as they lay out. You can see the slight little teeny bit of purple here showing through for the rubber O-ring, silicone O-ring. And then step 20 is putting that all together. So these screw pins here, I don't particularly care for these screw pins for a couple of reasons. One, they're made out of steel. They come pretty rough, and even if you use some Brasso or something to polish these up, they will over time absorb moisture and rust out, especially faster so if you're going to be running it in harsh conditions like a rally car would. Plus you can see there's very little thread on the screw pin, and that little bit of thread has a tendency to back out of the soft plastic that the arms are made out of. Soft plastic arms are good for lots of reasons, but not for holding in screw pins. So I generally will replace the screw pins with this. This is a low friction suspension shaft kit made for the TT-01, but it will work for this with some spacers. So this is the spacer kit. The kit number is 53539, and I use this little plastic a little bucket. It's got little arms to hold the cap on so I can keep it in my toolbox and it doesn't fall apart. I've got extra things in here in addition to what comes. This is the card that comes with the spacer set, so you can see all the different sizes, and these are to scale, as much of the Tamiya stuff is, so I can put the edge of the spacer on to make sure I've got the right one, and some of them are blue and some of them are silver, so you can tell the differences, right? The half increments are silver, the full increments are blue, so that makes it easy to see. So don't go by the picture here, go by this picture and this card of what will come with the spacer set. Before we get into putting this together, I'd also highly recommend that you, if you don't have one already, pick up a Tamiya E-ring tool. Part number is 74032. And what this tool will allow you to do is, with very little muss and fuss, install E-clips. I call them E-clips. They call them E-rings. This tool allows you to do that. Using needle nose to install E-clips is just an exercise in frustration. Clipped, pinched fingers, scored parts, lost E-clips. It's just a mess. So do yourself a favor and go ahead and buy this part. This is how it works. We stick the E-clip into the tool like so. As you can see, if I back it up some, there's a small ridge on the one side, so the clip is slightly bigger than it is on the other side, and that acts as a little shelf that the clip can sit in. So you just sort of snap it in like that, and then you press the hole over the shaft and it snaps down in as you push, because this little thing kind of expands out. I've been using this now for going on 2 years, and it doesn't really show any signs of wear. It's a wonderful tool. So when you get done, all 4 shafts will look like this. You have an E-clip on the end of each, and you'll have some spare E-clips with one bonus in case you happen to bend or lose one. So what you'll need is a 1.5 millimeter spacer. Conversely, you can use a 1 millimeter and a 0.5 millimeter spacer, but I prefer this, and I will show you why. So I'm going to first install my spacer onto the shaft, and then install the shaft into the arm as I'm putting the upright together. So this extra spacer is on the leading edge, frontward facing part of the arm. And then we put an E-clip on the back side. So this shaft again replaces the screw pin, right? Here's our out drive with our purple O-ring. Now the reason why I put the extra thick spacer on this side rather than the back side is because as the car is moving forward, it will take hits from the front. And I believe that having this extra 1.5 millimeter thick piece of aluminum protecting the majority of the surface area of my soft plastic suspension arm, as well as adding an extra strong foundation to my E-clip will not only help prevent the E-clip from possibly bending or popping free, thus losing my suspension shaft and having my car fall apart on the drive. It also adds some extra durability to the arm itself overall. So that's why I do it this way. And then go ahead and insert your dog bone, flip it up, insert the other one, put the E-clip on, and this is what you'll have. So again, the extra spacer there is to keep the slightly too long shaft from sliding back and forth inside this piece. So not only does the spacer add extra durability to the E-clip and possibly the suspension arm itself, but it keeps the suspension nice and tight, not wiggly. Moving on to step 21, attaching up the ball connectors to allow the suspension to connect. Now again, remember, the positioning of these ball connectors will vary depending upon the shocks that you use and the configuration that you're in. So what I've done, first of all, before we continue, is you'll need, of course, you'll be using a 2mm hex drive. This is the one that I'm using. But if you're not going to use the Tamiya tool, as I call it, the little 4-way thing, get yourself a good set of nut drivers. I find this one to be a really inexpensive set. The TRF stuff is spendy. I use this for my racing stuff, so I wanted to get good stuff. Now, while I do use the nut drivers as well for my racing stuff, I haven't invested yet, but the Dynamite stuff seems to be working just fine, so for the last 2 years, yay. So here are the part numbers for the 2 different tools that I'm using. So here's why I told you about these tools, is because the upper nut driver, or ball connector I mean, is a little different than most. You just don't screw it in with the nut driver like you do most of the others. What you have is a threaded shaft, or what they call a grub screw, that's rather long. You'll screw that in to the appropriate depth so that when you screw the ball nut down, they call it, the ball nut down, the top edge of the grub screw, using their terms, is lower than the edge of the ball nut. Right, so there's a slight angle here, and then it starts with a thread. So I set this up so that the top edge of the grub screw is just even with the bottom edge of this bevel. Okay, and you can then tighten down this ball nut extremely tightly using the nut driver, and you screw in the grub screw using the hex wrench. So that comes first, then the nut driver or the ball nut goes down and it tightens up. I'm saying all this because if you've been doing this for any amount of time, you're thinking that maybe you need to put thread lock on this part, because metal to metal thread lock is what we generally use. And I made that mistake first as well, and then more experienced people told me, nope, this type of setup is designed specifically so that you don't need to use thread lock. So there you have it. And then you go do both sides, and you install the bottom stock nuts onto the lower shock mount, or the lower suspension arm. So this is where your shocks will mount, upper and bottom. This is what it looks like from a slightly different angle, so you can see sort of we're using the lower hole on the upper, and we're using the upper hole on the lower. And then I went ahead and moved it down because I used the TRF shocks, and it wasn't working out quite so well, so I went ahead and moved it lower. And then after some use, you can see this picture was taken after I'd give the car a run a few times. What I discovered was the ball nuts and stuff weren't holding as tightly as I'd like. So I replaced the stock ball nut with this fluorine coated one, right? And as you can see, so that's the front. Sorry, this is the front. So I replaced the ball nut as this one was backing out a lot, right? So I replaced that ball nut with one of the grub screws, just like on the upper portion, and then I used the fluorine coated ball nut instead, because the fluorine coated, they have much smoother action. Okay, so that's the front. And then on the rear, I replaced the ball screw. I so many names, ball screw, the blue one that had just a 4 mm bit of thread. I used these hard hex head ball connectors. Okay, I use these in racing. This is the 8 mm. They also make a 4 mm, but I use the 8 mm because of the extended thread on the ball connector. So majority of this block now is threads for this ball connector. I was having a very frequent, these ball connectors were just bending and pulling right out of this soft plastic. So the extension has really made this not be a problem anymore. The other cool thing about these hex head ball connectors is that, as you can see, they're tightened in using a nut driver or a hex head wrench rather than a nut driver. So I don't have to pop off the shock like I've done here for illustrative purposes. I can just make sure it's cleaned out and then tighten it down while it's still connected. It's so nice. Okay, moving on to step 22, assembling the shocks. Now, these are the dampers that come with the kit. That's what the picture here is. They're silver in color. Most of the time they're black, sometimes white, sometimes yellow, but these happen to be silver color. And then this is kind of how you build them, normal CVA shocks. Well, I went with the TRF shocks because I wanted to see how much of a performance difference I would get. So I got the special damper hard black coating shocks, part number 42102. And this is what they come with. So as you can see, they come with brass ball connectors and nice shiny titanium nitride coated shock shaft. So these things should be just smooth as butter, and lots of extra parts than what their traditional shocks would normally come with. So these are slightly more complex build, and of course the normal V-trees down over here. So I thought I was going to be clever, and I was going to use the piston from the CVAs because I wanted some nice soft action, so I wanted to have the larger piston holes from that. So I went ahead and built these up. I just want to say right now that, as you can see, this is a bad idea. Do not build the TRF shocks using the CVA parts. Just build them all with the TRF stuff, because it's going to save you the headache of building them up like this. Like I did. See, I said, don't do this. This is a bad idea. And here are the parts. Normally we would just have a diaphragm and then we would stick it together, but this one has some foam pieces that go on top. Lots of extra O-rings that of course got some green slime applied to them. So we've got O-rings here that create a nice seal around the spring tensioner ring. And then we build up the bottom of the shock here using the included clearish white, milky white colored O-rings coated in green slime. And then there's a spacer, of course, coated in green slime. I push it all down so it's nice and flush. Then you build up the damper body. This cap goes on, that bit that you just saw. And then the spring tensioner goes on as well. So this is the difference. So as you can see, the CVA damper pistons are much thinner. They're also a different diameter. And once I got them into the shock body, they didn't actually move very smoothly at all because the piston size was wrong. So I had to go back and I had to unclip all the E-clips off the end of these, replace the CVA piston top with the TRF piston top. This is a special Delrin plastic or something. But anyways, it's super low friction compared to the standard plastic that's used over here. They're designed for these shocks. I don't know what I was thinking. Learn from my mistake. So, building up your shocks, one of the things that is a common area that people will use, they'll use needle nose, or they'll follow the instructions by wrapping a piece of paper or some cloth or some paper towel oftentimes around the shock shaft, and then use pliers to grip the shock shaft as they're screwing in the bottom connector. Well, another thing that I've discovered over time is if you get yourself a nice pair of shock shaft pliers, these are the Team Associated ones, ASC 1675. They are awesome. You don't need to have any paper or anything in between. You just squeeze them. There's no marring, there's no scarring, there's no lines, there's no ruining of your shock shaft. If you use pliers and you do mar the shock shaft, it will eventually abrade and cause leaks from that lower O-ring seals getting messed up. Plus, because they're not smooth anymore, the bottom part of your shock travel will be impeded. It's just horrible. So do yourself a favor. If you're going to be into RC much at all, get yourself a pair of shock shaft pliers. Doesn't matter the brand. Team Associated were well built and good price. So that's the ones that I went with. So anyways, I put them right up to the very bottom of where the threads end, as you can see, right, holding my left hand, and then I screw the lower connector on. Okay, so step 23 is filling the dampers with oil. Again, these are the CVA instructions where there's just a simple diaphragm with cap. Fill it up, work the piston so that it gets any bubbles out, slop up or mop up any overflow from the diaphragm, and do that in the fully extended position. Whoops. There we go. Mouse wheel moves the slides very quickly. So when I'm building shocks, I used to try to hold them in my hand, but then they would be angled and whatnot. And then I thought I was clever, and I would put holes in a small cardboard box, and I would use that to hold them. For all of the hassle, the $10 or so that this shock stand cost, it's a Duratrax one. It'll hold 4 shocks or 8 shocks at a time, although I don't know who would do it, but the hole sizes are different, so they'll work. There's a little reservoir or catch thing at the bottom so that if any oil drips down, it's not going to drip onto your table. It'll drip onto the stand itself, a little catch bucket. At any rate, DTX 2385 is a part number, and as you can see, I filled this up, and I'm using the stock 400 CST yellow colored Tamiya oil. It's 400 CST. And all 4, I'm just going to go from a base level, and then we'll see if I need to change up the dampening any. So fill it up. It comes with bubbles, of course. Work the pistons, give it a couple of taps with the screwdriver to get most of the bubbles out. Go ahead and drop the diaphragm down on. As you can see, as in the instructions, a little bit of oil came out. The TRF shocks then have this little foam pellet that sits on top of the diaphragm, and then the cap goes down on top. When I did that, of course, more oil spilled out over the edge of the diaphragm, and then the top retention collar goes down on top of this. So as you can see, slightly more complex than the standard CVA shocks. Then you just soak up all the oil with a paper towel. So this is what you end up with, right? So I used the short lower mount adapter, and then clean up all the oil off of the damper body itself, made sure that the lower and the upper ring were nice and snug. Damn. I'm going to use the keyboard instead of the mouse wheel. So then we're on to part 24. Part 24, which is installing the lower spring, or the spring and the lower spring retainer. So according to this, you would then use the clips to set your ride height, but of course with the TRF dampers, we have a threaded screw rather than the clips like the CVA, the included CVAs do. If you're not using the TRFs, what I've noticed running against my sons and daughters TT-02 Rally cars versus mine with the TRF dampers, I see no performance difference in a rally car. Right? I don't see any difference between the performance of my rally car versus my sons or daughters. So the shocks that my son's TT-02 are using are the silver CVAs that came with this kit, because I'm using the TRF ones. The ones that my daughter are using are the TT-02 upgrade kit CVA shocks. And the springs seem a little short, right? So we had to put in extra spacers in order to get them to work right. So I would say that probably the best bang for the buck is probably the CVA shocks that come with this TT-02R kit. I don't really see the value in upgrading to the TRF. Anyways, built up, this is what they look like. And 4 of them side by side. And then step 26 is to install them onto the car, and that's exactly what I did. So as you can see, this is the stock build on the rear. I'm using the regular standard aluminum blue ball connectors that came with the kit. And as you know from earlier, I would recommend, these are just fine, but these down here really should be replaced with those the hard hex head ball connectors, the 8mm ones. I can't stress that enough how much better for durability wise those others will be. All right, on to step 27, building up the steering linkage. Okay, so we've got some ball connectors here, and they have us shave off a little bit, and then included are the nice blue aluminum shafts, right? Steering rods, steering linkages, and then we've got the normal plastic steering parts that come with the TT-02 that everybody knows, and everybody knows it's a little sloppy. So one of the things that I did is I dipped into my racing bag and I got out a bag of the 5mm reinforced adjusters rather than the standard jobbies that came with. Okay, so the part number's here, 51283, and I used a pair of standard from True Value side cutters, and I marked to see how much longer they are than the ones that come with. Here's the a scale drawing of the ones that come with, and here's the reinforced. So I drew a line, I measured it out, drew a line, clipped them with the cutters. This is what I ended up with. I did have to use my Tamiya files just a little bit to get it down exactly the proper length. And this is what I ended up with. So please note the direction of the mark and go ahead and screw them down on your linkage arms. To do so, you probably will need to get yourself a turnbuckle wrench. Trying to do this with a pair of needle nose, as the instructions suggest, is another exercise in frustration. You'll mar the hell out of your center here. You'll scar it all up. It'll make it much more difficult to adjust. So a way that I do this is I screw them all the way down until they're flush. I'm not bothering with the measurements right now. I just screw them all the way down, holding the middle with the wrench, and then I tighten them down with my fingers. I did upgrade from the stock plastic parts because I do dislike how sloppy the stock TT-02 steering assembly is. So the part number is 54574. Aluminum racing steering set. This is spendy, but in my opinion it's worth it. So you can see it comes with all the spacers and grub screws and bits that you need, along with the aluminum arms and ball bearings. I do have some AG anaerobic gel thread lock that I use to screw in the ball studs into here and here. When you're using this stuff, if you've never used it, just put a little bit on the first 3 or 4 threads because it will feed down the rest of the way as you tighten. If you're going to use regular liquid thread lock, use the blue stuff, not the red stuff. Use the blue stuff and just put enough to fill in the troughs. You don't want to have it dripping off. And here's the instructions. Step 28 for attaching the steering linkages. As you can see, the standard one uses these step screws and some spacers, but the upgrade does not. So we'll use the grub screws and screw them down until the proper height is attained. And then there are some shields that drop down to protect the steering arm from the threads, because we've got this ball bearing. So that drops down and then we screw it down in, and we have our blue ball connectors that have been tightened down with thread lock on the ends here. And then what we do is we connect up the steering linkage arms. Notice the notch. You want to make sure that your notch is facing the same direction on both, right? So I'm facing it to the left because frontwards, the car is facing frontwards here, so we're looking at it from behind. And then once I get it on the car and snapped in, then I get my measuring device and ensure that I get the 38mm, or as close as I can get it, distance, right? So it's so much easier to do this. You just get your wrench, right? Your steering linkage wrench, and measure it up, turn it, measure it up, check, turn it back. It's so much easier to do it this way. Plus that way both sides are exactly the same. But you want to ensure that the notch is facing the same direction on both sides so that when you turn the wrench, it elongates or contracts always the same direction. So pushing forward, I believe, elongates, and pulling backwards contracts my steering linkage arms because the notch is facing to the left on both sides. You can kind of see it, notch here, notch here. This is what it looks like all set up. And then this is bag B complete. So what that mouse button, ugh, sorry. All right, so what we've got is we've got our suspension arms on. Yes, we have our uprights in the rear, our uprights in the front. We have our steering linkage, our hop-up steering linkage connected with the reinforced ball connectors. And we have our TRF shocks installed front and back. So I'm going to go ahead and render this up, and then I'm going to get to work on bag C. So maybe I can get it done by the end of Thanksgiving break. Maybe it will have to wait until Christmas break. But at any rate, I appreciate you guys hanging in there. And again, if you liked the video, please leave a like. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if you leave them in the comments. So that's all we've got.